So I've been putting this off for a while, but I mentioned in a previous video that I would like to cover the best-selling games for certain consoles in Japan as they aren't really discussed. And I wanted to start with the Famicom because what's a better starting point than that? But I had trouble with the concept, as my initial idea was to cover literally all 60 games on the list and get footage of all of them. But I realized that just wouldn't be feasible. Plus, a lot of games I'd be covering just aren't that interesting to talk about. And my gameplay footage would suck on games I'm not as familiar with. So instead, what I'm going to do is just read the list out and afterwards discuss points of interest regarding certain games' placements, analyzing the list. Now, the information I'll be using all comes from a website called Pico Pico Encyclopedia. I'll put a link to it on screen right now. This website tracks and catalogs releases for video game consoles in Japan, except it doesn't include handhelds except for the original Game Boy and WonderSwan, which were only recently added, or anything past the Wii U or PC platforms, or anything more obscure than the SG-1000, PCFX, and aforementioned WonderSwan. Honestly, it doesn't sound like that significant of a resource, especially compared to websites that focus on specific systems or companies, as this information exists all over the internet. But it does include information that can't be reliably found anywhere else, as it includes lists of the best-selling games for certain systems based on their Japanese sales figures and their Japanese sales figures only. This gives people outside of the country a very helpful insight into what Japanese gamers were into back in the day. And let me tell you, a lot of it's really different from the rest of the world. So I decided why not cover one of these lists in a video, starting with the Famicom. Now yes, we all know what game is number one, but I thought it would be interesting to look at the other games and their placements, as there are quite a few surprises. Now I should say the website doesn't include sources for this information, but I don't think I have much of a reason to question them, as these lists generally seem to be based on real data, probably from Famitsu, I'm not sure. And really, I don't think the exact figures matter all that much anyways. I'm only doing this to illustrate what things were popular in Japan, and the exact numbers don't really matter in that case. Plus, it wasn't like Nintendo was going to compile these sales figures together themselves to make a list like this. Also, this should go without saying, but data like this is never going to be realistically accurate anyways, so exact numbers really don't matter. Basically, don't take this too seriously. The purpose here is to have fun and look at cultural differences that are very much real regardless of tangible numbers. And yes, I know I'm doing the thing where I'm just reading off of a website anybody else can read, but I'm also trying to add context. Just keep in mind, I'm not a real gaming historian, I'm just talking about stuff I'm interested in. Now that we have that out of the way, let's begin by actually looking at the list of the best-selling NES games internationally so we can really see the differences when we get into the Famicom list. Though unfortunately I couldn't find a list that excluded Japanese Famicom sales figures, but this list will still paint a much different picture of what was popular on the system regardless. Here's the 15 best-selling NES games and what they sold. Why 15? That was the best range to cover. Let's go. Dragon Quest IV, Baseball, Kung Fu, Dragon Quest III, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Golf, Excitebike, Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, Dr. Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Super Mario Bros. 2 USA, Nintendo's Tetris, Super Mario Bros. 3, Duck Hunt, and Super Mario Bros. So that top 6 had higher sales figures for single games than any game on the Famicom list, which makes sense, but I'm just gonna tell you straight up, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Super Mario Bros. 2 USA, and Duck Hunt don't appear on the Japanese list at all. I'd say that most of Duck Hunt's sales coming from outside of Japan is impressive, but it was a pack-in title with most NES sets, so it really isn't. The games that require peripherals just weren't as popular in Japan, as they weren't pushed as hard. Keep in mind, I'm comparing a list of 15 games to 60 games, so there's even more games that were popular internationally that weren't as much so in Japan. And there's also the fact that the Nintendo NES version of Tetris never even released in Japan. I want you to keep this list in mind as I go through the Famicom list, as even though they share most of the same games, they're in different spots, and comparing the two lists will really illustrate the difference between the tastes of Japanese audiences and international ones. So now it's time to get into the Famicom list. But not only will I be covering the top 50 best-selling Famicom games, I'll also be covering the top 10 best-selling Famicom Disk System games. Let's get that list out of the way first, shall we? Now I should say right off the bat, this list here is a little questionable in one aspect. The Disk System had tons of games on it that were re-releases of games that were already on cartridge, yet none of them appear on the Disk System list. And I wonder if sales of the disc versions of these games were roped in with the cartridge sales numbers. Once again, don't take this too seriously, we'll never know. Anyways, here's the top 10 best-selling Famicom Disk System games. Golf US Course, Nazo no Murasamejo, Golf Japan Course, Metroid, Hikari Shinwa Palatina no Kagami, or Kid Icarus, Pro Resu or Pro Wrestling, The Legend of Zelda 2 Link no Boken, Zelda no Densetsu The Hyrule Fantasy, Volleyball, and Super Mario Bros. 2 aka The Lost Levels. So you may have immediately noticed something about that list. All 10 of these games I covered are first-party Nintendo titles. Either this is a really strange coincidence, or Nintendo was the only company releasing Disk System game sales figures. It definitely makes this list a lot harder to trust than the other lists on Pico Pico Encyclopedia, and I kinda wish they just mixed in Disk System games with the main Famicom list. They did that on their Mega Drive list by also including Mega CD games. But it is very possible, given how little third-party companies besides Konami push their Disk System games compared to Nintendo, that these really were the best-selling games for the platform. But once again, I guess we'll never know. I know there seems to be a narrative now that the Disk System was a failure, and while that isn't entirely untrue, do keep in mind that it is still the best-selling add-on for a video game console that plays its own games, despite only being released in Japan. And over half of the games on this list sold over 1 million copies. But it should also be noted that they're all from the first 2 years that the system was out on the market, nothing past that. Anyways, I guess I could point out a few other things about this list before we move on to the cartridge game list. The first thing I wanted to point out about game placements is that Metroid actually did well in Japan, which may shock some people as there's this narrative that Metroid isn't popular in Japan. While Metroid definitely isn't one of Nintendo's most popular franchises, I mean, Kid Icarus and Pro Wrestling outsold the first game, it still sold 1 million copies, so it isn't like this unknown thing. But another thing I need to talk about is these Zelda games. While the Zelda series is popular in Japan, it's not the sales powerhouse it is elsewhere. It's still Nintendo's third most popular franchise, but it's a distant third, though that kinda changed with the release of Breath of the Wild. Obviously, the 2 Zelda games being so high on this particular list doesn't really help illustrate that point, and that would be much better illustrated in the Super Famicom list. Now, Zelda 2 would be in between spots 13 and 12 on the main Famicom list, and Zelda 1 would be in between spots 11 and 10. So it wouldn't even crack the top 10, just barely be outside it, which I think perfectly illustrates Zelda's popularity in Japan. It is an influential and beloved series, but I think a lot of fans expect it to do way better in Japan for some reason. Every time I look for these Japanese game sales lists on the internet, I always see people in shock that Zelda isn't on them or relatively low, but the series, while popular, isn't remotely on the level of Mario or Pocket Monsters in Japan. And it isn't even really on that level in the rest of the world either, so I don't know what these people are expecting. Zelda isn't like incredibly unpopular in Japan, as some may have been led to believe, but it also isn't any more popular than it is in the rest of the world. And obviously, Super Mario Bros. 2 The Lost Levels is the best-selling game for the Famicom Disk System. And to put into perspective how well it sold, if it was on the main Famicom games list, it would be between spots 5 and 4 on that list. Anyways, I don't really have much else to say about the disk system, so let's move along to the main Famicom list, shall we? Final Fantasy II, Dragon Ball Z 2 Gekishin Frieza, Takeshi no Chosenjo, Bomberman, Donkey Kong, Dragon Ball Z Kyoshu Saiyajin, Hoshino Kirby Yumi no Izumi no Monogatari, Momotaro Densetsu, Star Soldier, Gradius, Twinbee, Ninja Jaja Maru-kun, Ice Climber, Takahashi Meiji no Bokenjima or Adventure Island, Kinnikuman Muscle Tag Match or Muscle, Rockman 3, Pro Yaku Family Stadium 88, Famicom Jump AU Retsuden, Load Runner, Doraemon, Senjo no Okami or Commando, Rockman, Dragon Ball Shenron no Nazo or Dragon Power, Gegege no Kitaro Yokai Daimakyo or Ninja Kid, Pro Yaku Family Stadium 87, Final Fantasy III, Spartan X or Kung Fu, Yonin Uchi Mahjong, Dragon Quest, Ninja Hattori-kun, Rockman 2, F1 Race, Dr. Mario, Soccer, Tennis, Excite Bike, Moero Pro Yaku, Mario Brothers, Makaimura or Ghosts and Goblins, Bulletproof Software's Tetris, Pro Yaku Family Stadium, Mahjong, Baseball, Dragon Quest II, Golf, Dragon Quest IV, Dragon Quest III, Super Mario Bros. 3, and Super Mario Bros. Yeah, who would have thought? If you're already familiar with how gigantic it is in Japan, it probably doesn't come as much of a shock to you, but yeah, Japan loves Dragon Quest. Despite Famicom sales going down in 1988, with it finally seeing some competition in the form of the PC Engine, which outsold it that year, 2 of its 3 biggest games came out that year. Spring and fall of 1988 were pretty much hell for anyone trying to release video games in Japan. You did not want to release anything near those 2 behemoths of threequels. Now, just because a game didn't make this list doesn't mean it wasn't successful. Just 100,000 copies sold is pretty impressive for a game in 1980s Japan. Renting games also wasn't a thing in Japan, but these numbers still reflect demand more than anything else anyways. Now let's jump into what I found interesting about specific games on the list. Final Fantasy III is the biggest non-Dragon Quest RPG on here, and yet all 4 of them still outsold it. But it's the game that basically made the series popular. Not that the previous 2 games were unpopular, its predecessor just barely cracked the list at number 50, but 3 was the big one. While most of these games likely got their sales from when they were first released, I'm willing to bet that games like Final Fantasy II and the first Dragon Quest got most of their sales after their sequels released, and people were itching for more. Spoilers, by the way, for the Super Famicom list. The Final Fantasy series was on a straight upward trajectory in terms of Japanese sales figures until Final Fantasy VIII. Actually, speaking of Final Fantasy III, it, Dragon Quest IV, Dr. Mario, and Kirby are the only games from the 1990s to crack the list. And Kirby is the only one to have been released after the Super Famicom came out. Unlike with the NES, late life Famicom titles tended to get ignored. But I guess Kirby had a lot more push, and it really does feel like a game for the kind of people who were later adopters of the Famicom, and was probably partially meant to capitalize on the younger generation that were receiving Famicoms as hand-me-downs. Also, there's only one infamous kusoge, or crap game on here. Takeshi no Chosenjo. Out of all of the Famicom kusoge, it's the best-selling one. Probably because of the big name attached to it, and oddly, Taito's best-selling Famicom game and the only one on the list. I'm honestly shocked that the infamous Atlantis no Nazo wasn't on here. That being said, there's still lots of bad license games on here. Yeah, Japan apparently has a way higher tolerance for bad license games than Americans do. Probably because they never got E.T. Donkey Kong's also the only game that launched with the system on here, and I'm honestly shocked it only ended up selling 880,000 copies. One thing I found interesting was that Star Soldier and Adventure Island seemingly both outsold Bomberman and Momotaro Densetsu, yet Hudson Soft would quickly abandon those series while Momotaro and Bomberman would be absolutely milked. though Hudson's licensed games sold better than all of them. Speaking of Adventure Island though, I find its inclusion on here funny because if you did grow up with the game in America, its appearance probably didn't surprise you, as that version's box specifically pointed out that it had sold over 1 million copies in Japan. It is odd though that there's this huge clump of games just listed as having sold 1 million copies and that's it. Now they're not placed in alphabetical order or anything, but they actually seem to be placed in release order, so this whole section of the list might be incorrect. Also, all of the STGs besides are together in that clump, and ironically, now that Hudson is owned by Konami, they're all Konami games. All their placements make sense considering they were the most heavily marketed and merchandised STGs of that era, even though I loathe the popularity of Konami's ones and I think they ruined the genre's reputation. I'm also not shocked that was the best-selling Namco arcade classic on the Famicom in Japan. Over there, its popularity is basically equivalent to Pac-Man's in the rest of the world, but I'm shocked it was the only one on the list. I would think the others wouldn't be trailing too far behind it. Instead, most of Namco's entries on the list are their Family Stadium baseball games. Oh yeah, speaking of which, I don't really have anything to say about the sports games. It's obvious why they sold well, and they're all over these lists, but the first Family Stadium in particular was very influential. That, and the amount of copies of Morero Pro Yaku floating around in Japan has become a meme. One interesting thing this list does is that it seemingly disproves a popular assumption though, and that's that Rockman didn't do well. It sold over 1 million copies. It could be likely that this is one of those games that sold more after its sequel came out, but I don't think that's the case. I think it not doing as well in the American market is the reason why Capcom wasn't interested in a sequel. Hence the whole story you probably heard of Rockman 2's developers creating it in their spare time as a passion project because Capcom wasn't interested in it. Speaking of its sequel, the sales number attached to it of 1.51 million is kind of suspicious because this is what a lot of sources, including Capcom's own website, list as its total sales figures. It could be likely that it actually sold a lot more outside of Japan, or Pico Pico Encyclopedia is just incorrectly using this sales figure for what's supposed to only be the Japanese sales figures. They seemingly made the same mistake with Makaimura or Ghosts and Goblins' sales figures. And also, I'm genuinely shocked that that was a higher seller for Capcom than Mega Man 2. Anyways, Mahjong is the best-selling Japan exclusive here, to no one's shock. Also, Nintendo being the most prolific publisher on here isn't shocking either. And another thing that comes to no one's shock is obviously the #1 entry. As I pointed out before in another video, Super Mario Bros. Being the best-selling Famicom game is way more impressive than it being the best-selling NES game, as it came out 2 years after the system's release and was never packed in with it. So it really serves as a testament to the impact that the game had. And yeah, those are all of the things I found interesting about these lists. Let me know what you found interesting or something that you think I missed. Once again, I need to remind you that these kinds of lists could never truly be accurate, so don't take all of this too seriously. Anyways, I definitely want to cover more of these lists, as I think they would be even more interesting with more obscure games, but I don't want to stray too far from this era yet. I feel like this video might be kind of rough, and I had been putting it off for a while because I wasn't sure how I wanted to do it. I'm very disappointed that I wasn't really able to get to show off these games as box arts, and I didn't want to just have the section of me reading the list be me scrolling through the list on the website, because I wanted most people to actually be able to read the sales numbers. I don't think a video like this is really about the visuals though. I was clearly figuring out what I was trying to do as I went along, so let me know how I could improve these in the future. I want to do at least 2 or 3 more of these. As always, a massive thanks goes out to my patrons, and thank you all for watching. Have a wonderful day.